Hey, everybody, it's Ed. Before we get started, I've got some new podcast supporters I want to thank. Chris Elise, Bill Bryant, and Ranchlands. These two people and one business all signed up to support the podcast on a monthly basis through Patreon, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody who's supported the podcast over the years. If you want to learn more about all the options for doing that, you can go to mountainandprairie.com/support. Thank you very much. Hey, this is Ed Roberson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Max Wenerstrom. Max is a blacksmith and craftsman who's best known for creating hand-forged knives that balance a beautiful aesthetic with practical durability. Max started blacksmithing at age 15. He became obsessed with the craft and quickly demonstrated an elite talent for creating one-of-a-kind knives. His passion led him to study under a 17th-generation Japanese bladesmith, who began teaching Max the art of forging knives in the Japanese tradition, a labor-intensive, time-honored method of creating some of the world's sharpest and most durable knives. I was introduced to Max by my friends at Ranchlands, one of the West's most respected ranch management companies. Max was participating in a residency at Ranchlands' 87,000-acre Chico Basin Ranch, where he was offering blacksmithing demonstrations and forging a specific model of knife developed in partnership with Ranchlands. It's a knife created specifically for ranchers, designed to be used on horseback for everyday work and high-stakes situations. So when my friends at Ranchlands told me about Max, I drove out and we sat down for an inspiring conversation. Max is only 21 years old, and as you'll hear in the interview, I was blown away by his maturity, work ethic, and commitment to quality. But aside from my endless amazement with his age, we covered a ton of interesting topics. We talked about his beginnings in the craft and what led him to study with the world-famous Japanese bladesmith Murray Carter. We talked about his dedication to creating the highest quality products, how he pushes himself to constantly improve his craft, and the hard work involved in both. We talked about how he started building his business during high school and how it has grown and evolved in recent years. We also chatted about his partnership with Ranchlands, the process of making a knife, his deep love of the West, and his advice for anyone seeking to begin a deliberate practice of craftsmanship. I really love this conversation and appreciate Max taking the time to chat. Be sure to check out the episode notes for links to Max's website and to the specific Ranchlands-inspired knife that we discuss. Hope you enjoy. Maybe the easiest way to start is just, when did knife making come into your life? Because I was thinking about your life, and how old are you? 21?
Mm-hmm.
Which makes me feel so old. So I was 22 when you were born. And so it wasn't that long ago that knife making showed up. So when did that happen?
So my friend Bryce that's out here with me now, we actually took a blacksmithing class back in 2014.
Okay.
And it was basically nothing more than like make an S-hook, make like a coat hook, just that kind of stuff, like basically small decorative blacksmithing stuff. And I just kind of got hooked on like just the feeling of forging the hot metal. And, ever since I was like really little, I would just like stick fire pokers in the fire and watch them heat up. My parents were like, why don't you become a blacksmith? Honestly, I never would have thought it came full circle. But after I took that class,
And where was it? Like at a
it was just at like
it
was out just like a church, like out in the country by us, probably about 15 minutes away. And it was just like this village blacksmith that worked in like an old historic village that did like a bunch of demonstrations and everything. Yeah, he was a great teacher to like get me started in all that stuff. He kind of showed me like how to build my own forge out of just like a brake drum, some piping, and like a hair dryer, basically. So I did that in the backyard, and shortly after that, I was course, into the outdoors stuff too. So I go to buy like a bushcraft knife, and it was about $200. And when I got it, I was just so disappointed in like the thickness of it, the edge. Like you couldn't even really cut through cardboard that well with it. And so I was like, man, what did I just spend my money on? Is this like the best knife that you can get for $200? So I started researching like what made a good knife. And then, Murray Carter started popping up. And so originally I was like, I kind of just want to take like a 2 or 3 day class or whatever. But then this program popped up called the Journeyman Program. And basically you go work for him for, I think it was 12 days.
So real quick, explain for people who don't know who Murray Carter is.
Yeah, so Murray Carter is the 17th generation Yoshimoto bladesmith.
17th?
Yep. So a long time ago, there was a bladesmith in Japan that started a shop, and it's just been generation after generation. And so, what's interesting about him is he's the first Caucasian in that lineage to actually take that, generational name. And it's really interesting because rather than kind of just letting it die with him, he's brought that to North America and started this Japanese bladesmithing school.
Yeah.
And, he's got like a couple apprentices under him now that make their knives under his name and sell them. And, he gets like whatever cut percentage of that.
Sure.
But, he's a great boss for all of those people. And everything that he does is just to propel you and your knife making and to get you to the next level.
Nice.
And so it's like, it was just no nonsense, 12 days. It's like flooding your brain on the first like 3 days of what to do. And then the rest was just like putting all of that to use. So you kind of got like muscle memory of what to do.
Sure.
And so coming home after that, just, kind of dabbled in it here and there. Wasn't really super serious about the whole knife making thing just yet. But, I thought it was fun. It was definitely hard.
And so at this point, this may be a dumb question. I'm just kind of amazed by the whole thing. You're still in high school at this point?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was actually a freshman when I took that blacksmithing class. I was just old enough to take the class. And then about 2 years after that is when I went and worked for Murray Carter in that Journeyman Program.
Okay.
And so going back to what the Journeyman Program is, it's unique because you get kind of a long-lasting mentorship with him. Basically, you are like, you got his number in case you need to, send him pictures of knives and say like, how's this look?
Yeah.
So I did that for a little while. And then another benefit of the Journeyman Program is he allows you to buy the Hitachi white steel, which comes directly from Japan. And there's only about 15 bladesmiths in the U.S. that are allowed to purchase that steel because of the reputation that they try to hold with it. So, in Japan, there's kind of that one method of bladesmithing. Obviously, there are bladesmiths that kind of stray away from that to do more of like mass production.
Yeah.
But the traditional Japanese bladesmithing really is to impart a fine grain structure in the steel through the forging process.
Okay.
So what makes it different than Western knife making is typically stock removal, where you would basically just take a bar of steel, lay a pattern on it, trace it, and then grind everything away. There are plenty of good knives that are done that way, but basically it doesn't impart the strength or the metallurgical, refining the grain structure and all of those things that allow you to, 1, have a sharp edge, 2, hold that edge for a long time, and 3, once it's dull, it's still easy to sharpen. And so
I'm just guessing the reason why that's not the standard in America is because it takes more work, it's more expensive.
It's basically, it takes longer to learn.
Yeah.
You're going to have more failures along the way.
You can't scale it.
Exactly. Yeah. So the biggest difference between like being able to do each knife yourself all the way through the steps and a factory is the factory has to shoot for kind of a happy medium so that, their knives aren't going to break on whoever, because there's always going to be someone that's harder on a knife and there's always going to be someone that's easier on a knife.
Yeah.
Now, in the custom knife making, you want to reach the balance where the person's generally going to be easier on the knife because you want it to be as thin as possible. And so that's going to make, it pass through things. It just makes it a better cutter. And so that's like the first thing I noticed when I bought that knife when I was young. It was like super thick and it just wasn't cutting. So, pretty much like, I'd say like 85% of factory knives could use about a 30% thinning.
Really?
So yeah, I mean, at least. And so I've done that with like a lot of my mom's kitchen knives and stuff like that.
You've thinned them out?
Yeah, because, people just aren't hard on their knives. It's it's a knife, it's not supposed to cut through nails or whatever. And so that's one thing that kind of bothers me when like a factory is like chopping through a nail just to show off the performance of their knife. It's like, you're never going to do that with your knife, realistically. And so therefore you want it to be able to cut better. So, you can make an axe of a knife that's going to chop through anything, or you can make like a surgical blade that's going to be, pretty flimsy here and there. So it's just about finding that happy medium for the user. And so basically, another way that kind of naturally happens in Japanese bladesmithing is by grinding the edge thin enough. If someone were to chip the edge, which in Western world of knife making is like, that's the end of the world. Like you chipped your edge. In the Japanese bladesmithing techniques, it's all about, if you chip that edge, you sharpen that edge back to that point where that chip was. And now that knife is exactly where you need it to be.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's not too thick. It's not too thin. It's just perfect for you now. So, chipping in like the Japanese bladesmithing culture is basically just making it more custom to you.
Yeah. This is kind of more of like a psychological question than, but what is it about your personality, would you say, that made you at such a young age? And I remember when I was 21, I thought I was really, really old, but I'm telling you, you're a youngster. and to go after this approach that is, to me, sounds like one of the hardest, most labor-intensive approaches you could choose. Like, if you're going to be a blacksmith, I would imagine there are a lot of cool things you can make that wouldn't require this much effort and time and focus. So, I mean, have you even thought about this? Like, why you chose such a involved process to be kind of what you do with your time?
Well, I'd be lying if I said my parents didn't have something to do with that. Yeah. But they've always been like, I was homeschooled as a kid, and I've always been in like programs that I felt like were just way too advanced for me. Yeah. And so it's until I was about like 14 or 15 is when like those things that you feel like you're not really learning kind of start clicking in your head, and then it's just easier to like pick up a book and comprehend things like that. So I feel like that kind of just gave me the skill set to understand myself better and like what it was that, I wanted to do to give myself purpose and this and that. And so my dad also was a big help because, he's worked in the corporate world pretty much his entire life.
Really?
Yeah. And so he kind of always pushed me and my siblings to sort of do something else, or
did he really?
Or just figure out exactly what it is that we want to do and not just kind of follow the same path as everyone else. So I think it was never like a giant pressure of like, you need to figure out what you're going to do by 18 or whatever.
Sure.
I was just honestly lucky enough to kind of start watching those YouTube videos and honestly get just so engulfed in it that I pretty much stopped doing my schoolwork and then just kind of started studying the bladesmithing stuff. And so it was just like a push for me to graduate high school so I could really just dive into it.
And so when was there a certain point, because you said you and your buddy took a blacksmithing course together, but was there a certain point when you realized, all right, I've got a talent for this? Because there's obviously like the hard work aspect of it, but there's something about the way you do it that, it seems that you have like an innate talent that other people may not have.
Well, thank you.
Did you?
I don't
you're extremely
really
humble, and you won't
much.
admit to it. But you do. Because you're 21 years old. You got all these awesome opportunities. But when was the point when you thought, all right, I can make a living doing this? Or was there a point?
Yeah,
it was just kind of
honestly, that just kind of came around this past year working with Ranchlands and everything. Yeah, so like my reputation as a knife maker was pretty much nothing. Like no one really knew about me. I was never really that interested in like pushing it on social media because I was like
humble again.
Well, it's just for me it seems more like if you're doing that, it's like you're not really living for yourself as much. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, I really want to be able to do what I want to do without being like this big star or whatever. And so it was like, I was always trying to avoid that, but you do kind of need like that social media presence to actually sell knives. Mm-hmm. And so I was lucky enough to kind of land this deal with Ranchlands after I donated 2 knives for their ground beef fund. And just after that, it was like I was selling like 20 knives to them a month or whatever. And now, we're going to be bumping it up to like 30 this year. So that has just been a huge help for me to just sustain sales because, there's so many times where you'll just have a slow month here and there. And, it's not exactly like hardship as a bladesmith. You're kind of expecting that.
Sure.
But, I'm extremely lucky and just so privileged to be able to have someone to buy 30 knives a month because there are so many guys that just, it's really what they want to do, but the market really just dictates what they have to do. And so a lot of them, can't make knives for a living anymore. And so, I'm extremely grateful, like I said, to be able to have this deal at only 21 years old and to be able to start building my reputation more and more as a bladesmith.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that real quick because this is the second podcast I've recorded at this kitchen table. So maybe I wish that we had video because we're at the Chico Basin Ranch, which is unbelievable. And for people who haven't listened to my interviews with the 2 Dukes, I'll have links in the episode notes. They can do that. But so talk about how you ended up here right now. And because we were talking about this earlier, and I said you need to be quiet because we
were spoiling the content.
Yeah. So tell me, how did this relationship develop with Ranchlands?
Yeah. So basically, in February of 2020 is when I went and did that 6 weeks. So I did the journeyman program in 2016, and then I went back in 2020 to do 6 more weeks with him, just to kind of like. Just as a skill builder, basically. And that was really beneficial because I actually had a couple years to go off on my own and make my own mistakes and then come back and have them corrected.
Sure.
So that seemed to really fast track things nicely. But it worked out well because right after I was working with him, I had about 30 knives stocked up and hadn't sold any of them. And they were just, this basic neck knife style.
Oh, cool.
But I had followed Ranchlands since probably 2017. I bought a belt from them with a collaboration with Filson they were doing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I figured out about them. And, I just followed them on social media. And in March 2020 is when they started to do that giving ground beef to less fortunate families in like Denver area, Colorado Springs area. Yeah. And so I was like really wanting to do something just to show like my appreciation because, luckily I wasn't being affected by it too harshly. And, I knew that, a job like ranching is already hard enough, especially, pandemic hits, it doesn't make anything easier.
Sure.
And so, I thought it was just a really noble thing that they were doing to be able to just take, livestock from their ranch and just give it away. And so all they were asking for was donations for processing fees. And so, timing worked out great. I had 30 knives. I didn't even have to come out of my pocket. All I had to do was just basically post the knives on my Instagram for like, the charity.
Yeah.
And so I think the first one sold for 150. And I can't remember if it was the first or second one that Duke the Third bought.
Really?
Yeah. But then I got a call right after that, and he was basically like, I like the knife, giving me the address to ship it to, which by the way isn't an address.
Yeah.
And so, we just kind of talked for a little bit, and it ended on the note of just like, we might like to work with you in the future. And so I didn't really think too much about it then, but I don't even remember how long it was after that they commissioned me to do, I think 5.
Yeah.
And that was the first set of knives that we did. That was the field knife, which was a little bit longer than the Remuda. I mean, they were selling for $250 on their website, and they were gone in like a day.
Wow.
And so, I was like,
could you believe that?
I couldn't believe it, because I could never do that.
Well, I mean, it's just, I don't know. I mean, that's something that you made, and that there was this just massive demand for. I mean, I bet that's kind of mind blowing.
Well, I think anything that they sell here at Ranchlands, people just see, how much good that they do for the land and everything. And people are just happy to support that and get a great product on the other end too. Yeah.
It's kind of the best of both worlds, because it's, you can depend, that the product is going to be top notch, whatever they're selling. And then that the people selling it are top notch.
Exactly.
So what's not done?
I mean, that's one of my favorite things about being able to work with them is like, I could go sell my knives in a local knife store around Columbus, and they would take a 30% consignment or whatever. But I would much rather that 30% consignment goes to, rebuilding America's grasslands and stuff like that, rather than just, Joe Schmo in a knife shop.
Yeah.
Sorry, River's Edge. I still love you guys. I definitely, I'm very privileged to be able to do what I love and also support businesses like this on the side. And that's, something that I've always been passionate about.
Yeah. Can you describe that knife? Because I've seen it on the website. That's the one?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's basically like a simple bird and trout style knife. It's probably about 6 or 7 inches long. And it's got about a 3.5-inch cutting edge. And basically, I was talking to Duke III when I was designing this knife, and we went through just a couple different renditions. One had like a finger choil there, and so they wanted to get rid of that so you could grip it better with a glove on. And so he had mentioned that they had recently had someone dragged by a horse. Their leg got caught up in, a stirrup or their rope or whatever, and they were getting dragged pretty far at pretty high speed.
Yeah.
And so, he was basically just trying to emphasize that they need something accessible and sharp so that, if anything like that happens, you can, get the knife right in your hand. Yeah. And so we just went with a super simple handle, and it's almost like imperceptible, but back here, there's a little bit of a recurve in the blade. And so what that does is it allows it to bite a little bit faster into materials like rope and stuff. That was just one of the things that he had brought to the table was, someone was getting dragged and it needs to be able to bite through things quickly. So just put a little bit of recurve in the heel and then sent them like the prototype. And basically they were like, let's just make the blade a little bit more narrow. And then we ended on this.
How cool is that?
Yeah, I mean, that was my first time really going through someone for like who knows what they want for a knife and everything. And that's like I was talking to Duke IV, and he was like, "Oh, I'm pretty picky with knives." But, that's what I like as a bladesmith, is to be able to like pick people's brains on what they think makes a good knife, and then eventually kind of come to a common ground on like what's practical and what they like and everything.
Well, I mean, it's, when you hear it put like that, it's much more than a knife. I mean, it's kind of a life and death thing. I mean, they want to know that if things go sideways, that they can count on this piece of gear. So like I do some mountain climbing stuff, and that's how these hardcore mountaineers, they got to know, they got to trust their gear, and they don't take anything extra. Everything they take has a purpose. And you're the man for making it.
Yeah, so that was kind of like the wake-up call for me. Was actually about a year before that, I had sold a knife to a buddy of mine on a hockey team, and he had given it to his brother, who was a Green Beret. Ooh. And he was like, "Oh yeah, he's going to carry this on his vest." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And so it's like everything got real serious after that. And it's like that, I think kind of having those experiences is what makes you feel the necessity of like upping your game with everything and just paying close attention to everything that you do. Because if I had a knife fail on a Green Beret, there's no coming back from that.
So what did you think, when you get the Green Beret or you get the Phillips at Ranchlands, who are, they're all very serious about what they're doing. I mean, do you ever have I'm just projecting my own insecurities onto you, but I'm like, do you ever have the idea of like, why, I don't know what I'm doing. Like I've only been doing this a few years. Like, but if they trust me, I must know. I mean, because I would imagine, unless you're like an egomaniac, it's probably a little mind blowing to have to know that kind of stuff.
It for sure is. Yeah. I mean, it's been surreal, honestly, ever since. I'm just now getting to a point where I can like make the knives without thinking too much about like what's going on with them. But basically for me, it's always been like just watching everything you do throughout the process and seeing how the knife reacts all the way throughout. And, you know, I would never sell something that I didn't fully believe in. Sure. So, you know, if I were to get to the end of the process, sharpen the knife, and if I can't get a great edge on it because, the heat treat went wrong or the forging process wasn't ideal, then I'm just not going to sell it.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's just a terrible blemish on your reputation to just put out whatever you make. So, you know, for me, it's like my teacher's process is in a way that like if you're making a batch of 10, you should try to have one that doesn't turn out well.
Yeah.
And so that kind of just shows you that like you're pushing everything to the limits. Mm-hmm. And so you're, like especially in kitchen knives, if you have, 10 kitchen knives and you go to quench them all in water, which is the harshest quenching medium, then if one of them bends or breaks or twists really badly, that's a good sign because you got that one out of the way and the other 9 are just right.
Nice.
So it's like, if you can have that 9 out of 10 consistency, that's not a bad thing as a bladesmith at all.
Sure.
What's bad is having 10 out of 10 every time and never having those failures and never really seeing how far you can push it.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. So that particular knife for Ranchlands, how long does that take? Can you like walk me through the process of making that?
Yeah. So usually I do them in batches. Mm-hmm. So it would, it just makes everything a lot quicker, not having to go from machine to machine, grinder to grinder. This knife would probably take about 6 hours start to finish for me. Obviously, there's people that could do it much quicker, but that includes the time that it takes for the blade to anneal, which takes about an hour.
What does that mean?
That's a process in the heat treating that basically right after forging, you'll heat the knife up to like a dull red temperature and stick it in a bucket of ashes. And that basically takes some of the stress out of the steel so that you can work it on the grinders, drill holes in it, this and that, going into the heat treat. And the actual heat treat, the quenching and the tempering is where the knife gets its soul, basically. And so that hardens, quenching the knife hardens it. You'll heat it up to about 1500 degrees and then dunk it in the water. And so that'll make the knife super hard and actually really brittle too. And then the tempering process is taking a little bit of that brittleness out of the steel. So we'll heat it back up to about 400 degrees, 375.
Yeah.
And that'll give us basically just like the perfect edge that we need for, moving forward.
So in this whole process, I mean, it seems like there is a, somewhat formula for it, but then it's the science and the art. And there's a lot of, I would imagine the art is that fine tuning.
Yeah, so that's what really interested me in like the Japanese style of bladesmithing was it's so much more like just organic and natural than like, I've always hated math and, like I'm not even really that good at like construction, following instructions, stuff like that. But, it just felt so organic being able to just like take the piece of steel, forge it out till it looks like a knife, cut it out till it looks like a knife, and then, go through the rest of it. And none of it's like hard to understand at all. Sure. Like it's incredibly simple, but I think about 2 years in, I kind of regretted that because I was like, man, these knives suck that I'm making. But it was like, people would still buy them to support and, they had good edges and everything. And that's basically all that really matters. Sure. You're always going to have cosmetic errors when you're first starting out. But, basically like that's what got me so interested was just like the simple organic nature of the Japanese bladesmithing and just like not having to worry about all these different numbers and machines and all this stuff. So like if you'll go see my shop later, I've got it pared down right now, but it's really not that much. Like I can fit everything on one bench and
I was surprised when we were talking before they started recording that you drove out here and you fit it all in your truck and you got it set up in there.
Yeah. And so, that was that's good for me to know, to just be able to go do demonstrations anywhere in the country now.
Sure.
But, you know, it's really nice being mobile like that. Mm-hmm. And there's just really not that much you need to make knives. Mm-hmm. Like basically a bandsaw, a drill press, and a grinder will do everything you need. Now, there are a couple others that'll make your life easier or make, you know, your end product better, like a buffer, mm-hmm. but it's not necessary at all. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you can really get into the craft for a couple $100s.
I think that's one thing I wanted to hit on was, you know, what would be your advice to a young person trying to get into? Because it's not at all related. I'm not comparing myself to you because this is silly stuff compared to what you're doing. But like people send me emails all the time that I want to start a podcast. I'm like, don't worry about the equipment. Buy the cheapest thing you can find, then just start talking.
Exactly.
You know, and so I mean, is that similar advice in your world?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that, you know, everything in life is like buy once, cry once. Mm-hmm. But you know, when you're first starting out, it's good to just get your feet wet and make sure it's what you want to do before you go spend $2,000 on a grinder. Mm-hmm. But you know, like I was basically just starting at, you can make a knife with nothing more than an angle grinder and a couple files. Mm-hmm. So that would cost probably $55 at Home Depot.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. And, you know, that's actually kind of how I started out making knives, was just like YouTube video, stock removal. And so I don't even really consider that like the same as bladesmithing, because that was just like something I did like 2 times. Mm-hmm. And then I finally like came back around to all of that. You know, I think best thing to do is just if you're interested in the forging process, especially, is to get a small gas forge, because, you know, propane is so much more accessible for so many people than coal.
Yep.
And, you know, you can just take it to your local tractor supply or whatever and get your tank filled up. But the forge I have out there, I just recently got. It's built in Texas. It's only like $120.
Oh, wow.
And so, you know, you can start with that. And then the best thing to do for finding an anvil is basically just go to like flea markets, scrap yards. And basically, like, the older the anvil, the better, because they have a lot more rebound. Mm. And so that bounces the hammer back up into the air so you're not killing yourself.
Sure.
But there's a lot of like junky cast iron anvils on the market now that have pretty much no rebound whatsoever. But that's because a lot of people don't use them for blacksmithing. They'll just use them for like straightening metal or whatever.
Oh, okay.
But those are the kind of things that you just have to watch out for to not waste your money on. But other than that, you can just get into the craft right after that. And one of the best things to do to practice forging knives isn't actually forge knives. It's like forge chopsticks and forge, you know, all these different things so that you get the feel for the hammer and you get the muscle memory for everything. And then going to forging a knife is like, this is the simplest thing ever.
Yeah. That makes sense. So back to the apprenticeship. I mean, obviously you learn technical skills, but I would imagine, what's his name, Murray? Mm-hmm. Like, what makes him such a unique teacher? I mean, what the non-technical skills did you learn from him? Kind of the softer skills. I mean, obviously he's probably maybe a bit of a perfectionist. I mean, he's not afraid of hard work.
There's so many things that, like, I almost forget now making a knife that is just, you know, it seems like just so natural now. But like, for example, when you're laying out the pins on a handle here, you take you'll like center punch the bottom mm-hmm. pin, and then you'll center punch the top pin, and then you'll find the distance between those two, and you'll cut that middle pin right in there.
Yep. And
so basically, one way to make a knife not look bottom heavy is you move that middle pin up literally just a hair. Uh-huh. And so that gives the knife just a little bit more of a forward feel and everything. And so it's just little things like that about like design, and, you know, the way that he can just like take a knife and just sight down it like that until you're off just a millimeter here.
Yep.
This would look better if you just brought that in just a tiny bit. So, you know, it's just stuff like that like he teaches you to use your eyes more than anything. Mm-hmm. And so you use your eyes to watch the temperature of the steel. You use your eyes to, you know, make sure you have a good consistent line across the spine of your knife, and not, you know, a little tiny bump that's just hiding in there somewhere that's going to be a hot spot when you get your handle on and mm-hmm. someone's cutting through something. Mm-hmm. So it's just stuff like that. That's, you know, it seems so simple, but it's almost like you'd never think of it on your own if you were just about to dive into making knives, you know?
Sure. Are there any other craftsmen that you admired? Maybe, not in knife making specifically, but just people that make high quality stuff that you admire?
Oh, absolutely. So, Alex Pohl is a English blacksmith, and I mean, his work is just incredible. He does everything from like pots and pans to axes, knives, utensils, all that kind of stuff. And so his thing has been like kitchenware lately. And so, kind of same as me, like started the pandemic, he's had to shift a couple things, but he does demonstrations. He makes beautiful, like I said, just hand forged cookware and everything. And, I've always been interested in that because, my entire family loves to cook. My mom's a personal chef. My sister's a personal chef.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So honestly, that's kind of how I got into especially the Japanese bladesmithing, was because their kitchen knives were considered like the best. And so naturally, coming from a cooking family, it was like I wanted to make a better kitchen knife.
Yeah.
And when my mom first bought one of my teacher, Murray Carter's knives, she went home and sliced through a pineapple with it, and she was like, just jaw on the floor.
Like, what have I been doing the whole life?
Yeah. And so that's kind of like what solidified for me that like there's so much better, you can just do so much better than what's out there on the market. And I think that goes for a lot of things, but it's just, you have to really believe in what you're doing and not shy away when you have no sales after 3 months. If it's truly what you believe you need to be doing, then eventually things will line up.
Well, when I looked on your mentor Murray's website, it looked like he looks like he's got quite an operation there. It looks like he's got some folks working with him. I imagine that you're pretty focused on the process at the moment, but like, do you think forward about where this is all going? Like, do you think about building it as a business or anything like that? Or
oh yeah, for sure. So honestly, like,
you got to understand. Unfortunately, I have an MBA, and so that nonsense is like stuck in my head. Like scale. I'm like, no, be quiet. He's a craftsman.
No. My dad has always been really helpful with that. Just kind of, I was actually 17 when we started the Wenerstrom Forge LLC, and basically he was like, I'm not going to do this until you have like a set of goals lined up for yourself. And so that was just really helpful to me. It was like, sell $15,000 worth of knives in a year. And so, after I did that, it's like confidence gained. And so you have to have, this is one of my mentor's biggest things, is short-term and long-term goals that are, you want your short-term goals to be easily accessible. And then your long-term ones, the payout will, be worth it. But basically, if you have those short-term and long-term goals, you just start building so much confidence of like what you're capable of. And so, for me, it seemed like the first 3 years I was really trying hard to like build the business, like pushing the social media, all this stuff. But then it was like, it almost seemed like word of mouth was working better, and just kind of sitting back and making more knives and letting the knives speak for themselves just kind of built my reputation naturally.
Yeah, that there's this marketing guru that I'm just obsessed with. I've read everything he's put out, and his name's Seth Godin, and that's kind of his thoughts on whether you're, a writer or you're making a podcast or a craftsman. Like, if it is good, word will spread.
Exactly.
And there's nothing more powerful than word of mouth recommendation.
It is hands down the best way to spread the word about a business, because, if someone has one of your knives and they're talking to their friends about it, they're going to trust their friend a lot more than some infomercial.
Sure.
So, that's always been kind of my biggest thing, is like, get to know the people who are buying your knives, make sure they know that you're there for, warranty, coverage, all of that stuff. And, once they start to trust you, it's like they just buy more and more and more knives.
Yep.
And so, I've got a couple customers that are just like, they've been with me since I started basically. And, anytime I'm in a pinch, they're like, if you got a knife to sell, I'm buying it.
Yeah.
So it's great to have people like that. And I think that's another super important thing about a small business, is building those personal relationships, and also just being charitable. I mean, people don't want to work with someone who's not charitable.
Sure.
And so that's kind of one thing that I took away from my mentor was he was like, just be charitable. People will want to work with you a lot more naturally. And so, I kind of took that advice and donated those 2 knives, and then boom, all of a sudden, it's still so surreal to me to be able to, I'm sitting in Duke's house right now. It's all so weird.
Well, I mean, you've earned it though. And I think what you learned from age 16 to 21, I think I learned age, 37 to 43. So you're ahead of the game, but I think that spirit of generosity is huge and just approaching things, and it does come back. But back to the word of mouth, I mean, that's the way that it can scale, I guess, if you think about it in those terms, is what's happening right now with Ranchlands. I mean, they are giving their word of mouth recommendations to all of their followers, and they may personally know some of them, but most of them they don't personally know. And then people are like, well, if Ranchlands vouches for them, I want in on that.
Exactly. And so that's why, for me, it was like, I think there was, when I made that last batch of knives for them right before my brother and I went out to California for a couple months, I think it was 20 or 25. And I think someone bought like 12 or 18 of them. And I was like, I need that customer.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But, I think they just have such a broad range of people. I mean, they've been on TV and all of that stuff. So again, that's why it feels so surreal for me to be here. Is like, I just wanted to be a bladesmith and make knives, not do any of this stuff. But, again, like if you believe in what you're doing, it all comes full circle. But I think all of the people that kind of follow Ranchlands see all the good that they do, and they're again more than happy to open up their wallets to support the range conservation and also get a good product in the end.
Yeah, and you think about how they run their business and what kind of connected the two of you, their organization and you, is that you were both being generous and you were both thinking, I want to help. And then I think, you probably kind of noticed each other and like, hey, wait, we've got our values are aligned.
Exactly. I mean, and that was just, I was in the position to be able to help. Like I said, I mean, I was living at home, so I didn't have, rent to cover and stuff like that. So it was just natural for me to, want to help. There was so much going on, and, it was such a dark time of like what's to lie ahead, and so many people getting laid off of their jobs and everything, and just a struggle to feed your family. And so that's something that I've never had to go through, and I've never even gone through any hardship like that in bladesmithing. Sure, you got a couple months that'll go not selling too many knives, especially after Christmas. That's just natural.
Yeah.
I was never in too hard of a spot, especially with where we live. Our neighbors, they have cattle, they have dairy, we have a baker. And so, everything's kind of like in a 5-mile radius that we need. And so it just really made me understand and appreciate what I have and the privilege I have to be able to do this, and not only for myself, but to help, other people.
Dude, I need to talk to your parents, get some parenting advice. They know what they're doing. All right, here's a very specific question, and it may be hard to explain. You can point me to YouTube, but all my kitchen knives are dull as shit, and I need to sharpen them. I probably should just buy new knives after hearing this, but I thought they were pretty nice. How do I sharpen my knife? Give me the scoop.
So the real question is the secondary edge dull or is the primary edge dull? So basically a knife has 2 edges. Your bevels here that are just, the ground part of the knife that, starts to taper down towards the cutting edge.
Yep.
And that sharp cutting edge that initiates the cut, that's your primary edge. And so the secondary edge is what glides through things. So you have to have a good relationship between your primary and secondary edge to make a knife cut well. So, you can have a super sharp primary edge and a really obtuse secondary edge.
I got you.
And then it just, you might be able to slice paper really well, but it's not going to pass through, food or, whatever medium you're going through. And so basically thinning down, like I said, I've thinned down like a lot of my mom's kitchen knives and stuff like that. So by thinning down that secondary edge, your primary edge can actually get fairly dull, and it'll still slice through things like no other. So that's what's really interesting about it is when you do actually have a knife that's ground properly and that super sharp primary edge and that, acute secondary edge, that is really what just makes it just glide through food like no other. And so a lot of people just think, they just feel the edge on their kitchen knife and they're like, oh man, this went dull. But, a lot of the time my mom will be using her kitchen knife dull for like a month and it's still going through onions, and she'll be like, did you sharpen this? And I'm like, no. So yeah, that's what's really interesting about all of that is it's not just what you feel on that sharp edge, but it's really the secondary edge. And so the way that you kind of do that at home, the best thing to get is throw away all your gimmicky pull-through sharpeners and everything, because those just take off a lot more metal than you really need to. And so with a Japanese whetstone that you soak in water, basically you're just like raising the knife up to the angle that you need, and you're just kind of pushing it back and forth on the stone. And by doing that, you take off the minimal amount of metal so that your knife lasts a lot longer. You're not sharpening it down like a 1/4 inch every time.
Sure.
But the other thing that does is I go from about, if there's no edge on a knife whatsoever, I only use 2 to 3 stones maximum. And so you can get away with like a 400 grit, 1,000 grit, and a 6,000 grit, and you'll be shaving sharp every time.
Really?
And a lot of the time, if you catch it, you don't have to go all the way back through that process. You don't have to go all the way down to 400 grit. So, any serious chef that has a good knife knows that if you just come into work in the morning and you give it a couple passes on a 6,000 grit stone, it's going to keep that edge for months.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that I try to really impart with my knives is like just the maintenance, because, every knife is going to get dull eventually, but you can prevent it for so long with this kind of steel. And that's like kind of the whole point of it, is just to be able to touch it up in like 20 seconds. And then you're right back to where your original edge was.
Wow.
And so the best way to, back to what you were asking about, how to kind of sharpen your own kitchen knives at home, a basic guide, if you're just going to sharpen your primary edge, is put a pinky under the spine of the blade. So like if this is your knife lined up on the stone, that pinky under the blade kind of gives you like a preset angle.
Oh, okay.
And it's not perfect for every knife, but it's a good general, rule of thumb. And basically, you're just acting like you're slicing into the stone, and then you'll do that on both sides. And then you'll work your way up to the 1,000 grit and 6,000 grit. And on the 6,000 grit, you'll actually kind of strop it backwards across the stone. And what that does is it allows the edge to kind of hover over any like undulations in the stone.
Yeah.
So instead of, bumping into those and becoming more dull, you're going straight back and just pulling that edge to a super fine point. And that's basically it. I mean, there's, like I said, Murray Carter on YouTube has so many sharpening videos that within 5 to 10 knives, you'll have so much more confidence in just being able to touch up anything.
I'm going to look that up. That's one of those things that it's just a day, use knives multiple times a day. They get dull. And I mean, I feel like that's just a life skill that humans should know how to, I should know how to sharpen knives. I know how to do a lot of other dumb stuff or stuff that's a lot dumber than that. Like I should know how to sharpen a knife.
It just makes life just better.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing is like, I firmly believe that if you have a sharp knife in the kitchen or in the field or whatever, you'll be excited to use it. Yeah. Cooking dinner goes from, I got to cook dinner at the end of the day to, a methodical process that you could actually enjoy because you're not just struggling to hack through a tomato or whatever. So, that's what I find really just so interesting about like, you can take such a mundane task and you can make it actually fun to do just by how easily your knife glides through something.
And it would give you an appreciation for this tool that's in your life every day that you don't even think about. And then all of a sudden it becomes something of interest.
Right. And and honestly, the simplest thing like that can make you open your eyes to everything around you and all of the craftsmen that are just super. And, so like before I started blacksmithing and bladesmithing and everything, you'd look at like woodworking projects, like, that's probably easy. Mm-hmm. And now I look back and I'm like, man, those guys are talented.
Well, that's like when we were sitting down in these chairs, we were like, man, these chairs are heavy.
Yeah.
These things must be well made.
So there's a lot of that stuff that like just blows my mind, especially like super old architecture and stuff. Mm-hmm. The fact that they were, back in like 1400 building these like beautiful monasteries that are just incredibly adorned with like stained glass and just chisel work and everything. It's insane the skills that they had back then, and just as a standard, mm-hmm. and how much of that we've lost as a society.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think that stuff just makes things. It's like reading. I read a lot of history, and if I go somewhere and I've read a history book about it, I just appreciate my time in the city or wherever I am so much more. And I always wish I had started doing that earlier. And you think, like with the knives, every day, it just makes you more connected to stuff. Absolutely.
So that's why, like, anytime an opportunity like, this interview with you pops up, mm-hmm. I'm happy to take it, just because it's like,
I heard they made you do it.
Yeah, Tess was strong arming me into this one. But yeah, I mean, it just makes me have such an appreciation for, like, one, how small I am in the world, mm-hmm. and how small what I'm doing is, but also kind of the impact that you can have. Mm-hmm. And so, at the same time that you feel so small, all of a sudden you get a call from Duke III who's like, hey, we want to work with you. And so then it's like, okay, maybe this isn't super small anymore. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, I have just such a tiny part in what they do out here, but I'm just so thankful to be, out here right now and be able to work with them and support them with my work. I mean, I never would have thought that was going to be a reality even a year ago, honestly. Mm-hmm. And so it was just like March 2020, the appreciation for everything, for my craft, for, what I've learned, for my customers. It was like, I just had to be able to give back. And so that's why I'm so happy to be in a position now where I'm not struggling so much to sell, X amount of knives per month, and I can support myself and others.
Sure.
So,
no, it's inspiring.
Best of both worlds.
Yeah, definitely. But it all comes from your commitment to the craft. Without that, it all disappears, One other very technical knife question that popped in my head that I've never thought about until this conversation. What's the story of serrated knives?
Don't ask a bladesmith that.
Yeah, I want to hear it, because I'm thinking I don't need them anymore.
No, so honestly, if we're talking about a bread knife, that can be that can be nice for going through like crusty loaves of bread or whatever. But honestly, if you have a sharp, plain edge knife, it's going to cut 10 times better than a serrated knife every time. So I'll see like a lot of people that just use serrated knives on tomatoes because mm-hmm. their plain edge gets so dull that it won't even pierce the skin. But, if you just keep that edge in shape, you're never going to need a serrated knife again. Even on a lot of breads, I mean, like, if it's straight out the oven, it's going to be harder to cut. But if you let it sit for an hour, you can still cut it with a plain edge knife super well. Okay. So it's interesting how there's definitely a lot of dogma in like what makes, like a good kitchen knife and everything. And so, like I was saying, people will like demonstrate chopping through a nail with their knife. And it's like, you're never going to do that in the kitchen. What you need to demonstrate in the kitchen is slicing through tomatoes and cucumbers and all that stuff. So yeah, that's what you're actually going to use the knife for anyway.
No, all right. I thought that was going to be your answer, but I just wanted to confirm. All right, I'm getting ready to go on a knife sharpening tear in my house. It's going to be awesome. So where do you get your inspiration? Like, do you have time to read many books? Do you like other kinds of art? Do you watch films? Like, I read a ton of books, and people who listen to this podcast are all about books, but sometimes I spring that question on people. They're like, I wish I had time to prepare. But I mean, where do you get your inspiration?
Well, growing up, my parents would take me and my siblings to Montana for like a week or two.
Nice.
And, we would just do a lot of really like remote hiking and, staying in cabins that were off grid and stuff like that. And so naturally I just kind of started reading like Western books, Louis L'Amour and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And it just kind of became like, I would get home and it was like, there's so much that lies beyond the Midwest, and that's all I had ever really seen growing up was like from Midwest down to like Florida and everything till I was like probably, I think I was about 7 or 8 the first time we went to Montana. And so that was just like instantly just mind blown on like what's beyond.
Sure.
And so, you know, that's honestly what made my brother and I go spend some time in the California desert, was just because like we don't want to, you know, have to settle down in a place just because, you know, we want to be able to see the country and actually go where we want to go, and not, you know, like I said, just settle down because you have to or whatever. So I think it's important to get out while you're young and see all that stuff, so you don't like, you know, buy a house somewhere and then you go somewhere and you're like, oh man, I love it here. You know,
you make a conscious decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, I used to think where you live didn't really matter too much about like, you know, your lifestyle or whatever. But, you know, for me, it really does. You know, like
it does.
Everything I like to do is outdoors, you know, this kind of stuff. And so, you know, there's not a ton of that in Ohio. I mean, you know, there's fishing, there's ponds, there's places you can camp and whatnot. But, you know, just like the sheer size of everything out here just seems to like make your mind wonder about like the history and what was here before, and, you know, what's going to happen in the future with the land. Yeah,
it's a completely different scale. I mean, that's how I'm from North Carolina originally. And I mean, I didn't move out here until I was 27. And
have you been out here since?
Yeah, I've been out. I went back for grad school, and then I spent a year in Central America, and then back out
that's
here.
Awesome.
So, yeah, but like when I went back to grad school, I was thinking, all right, I'm going to go back, get my MBA, and then I'll stay in North Carolina and get a job there. But I met my now wife around that time, and she was thinking the same thing, both moving back east for grad school. And after being there for 2 years, I mean, that's where my family is. That's what I love. You know, that's home. Mm-hmm. But we both were like, we got to go back out there.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. And I feel exactly the same way. Like, you know, my family is on a farm about 40 miles north of Columbus, like I was saying, and I love it there. And, you know, obviously I love my family, but, you know, it just becomes what you need, really. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't really think you could be happy living for anyone else but yourself. And, you know, sometimes that may sound selfish, but I think if you have a good heart, you believe in what you do, and you support other people along the way, then, you know, you're allowed to go do what you want, see what you want, and live where you want.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you think about it, just like if you know, think about us as animals. I interviewed this guy a few weeks ago for a non-podcast event, and he's an ornithologist, a bird expert. And he was talking about, you know, kind of the parallel between humans and birds, and how you got to find your environment, the environment that works best for you. And out here it's definitely my environment. Like, I'm definitely happier, and it could be the landscape. I mean, I think it's a combo of the landscape, but the people are so interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And they
it's just
want to be here.
It's just like an infectious inspiration out here. Mm-hmm. I mean, from waking up to the birds and looking out at Pikes Peak from my tent, it's like, you know, I'm ready to start the day right away. Yeah. Whereas in, you know, back home, you might sleep until like 8 or 9 and you're like, oh, it's just a drag to get out of bed and start the day or whatever. But, you know, I think for me, it really does matter where I live in just relation to the inspiration that I gain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and I would imagine, I'm not a craftsman, but I would imagine being around other creative types, other craftsmen. I mean, I think that's huge, and you can find those, but it seems like there are lots of pockets of those throughout the West. And a lot of people I have on this podcast are craftsmen.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm really excited to get in the leather shop with these guys here, because I mean, they're so talented. Everything they put out is, from the handbags to the belts to the knife sheaths, everything is just such solid quality that, you know, leatherworking is something that I've always wanted to try. And, you know, I've like dabbled in it a little bit, but just having, you know, an actual mentor that knows what they're doing just fast tracks everything so much. And, you know, I think that is one of the things that you should never feel bad about in your craft, is spending money to go learn from someone else that's better than you, or, you know, even on the same level as you, because everyone just has a different outlook on things and a different perspective and a different method for doing something. And I think by, you know, like for example, my teacher in Japan, he was studying for 18 years. Wow. And he had a very different kind of experience with his mentor than, most Japanese, like wax on, wax off, like you're going to do this. His mentor was more of like a coach that was like, go learn from these guys that down in, Osaka, because they know how to heat treat knives really well, and then go up north and learn from these guys because they know how to forge really well. And so he was able to take all of those methods and combine just the best techniques of every single bladesmith and kind of perfect his method. And so I think that's really important, just to go, that's why pretty much the only reason I still have like Instagram or social media or whatever is just because it's, good to wean information and inspiration off of fellow bladesmiths, blacksmiths, whatever. I mean, there's plenty of stuff that's not even related to knives that I'll just gain inspiration from all of a sudden. And it just, ends up coming out in the knife.
There's a guy that I had on the podcast. I met him through the podcast. He's up in Colorado Springs where I live, and he actually lives like 2 blocks from me, and his name's Jeffrey Keating, and he's a woodworker. I mean, master woodworker. And I'm just keep thinking, I'm like, you guys would really hit it off. It's funny because we met through the podcast, and now our girls are on the same soccer team. We're like hanging out doing dad stuff together. But I mean, I'm just thinking of all these different craftsmen I've had that I want to introduce you to, because, man, I'm very impressed, man. Not that it matters what I think, but it's inspiring. I love talking with you. As we kind of wrap this up, what would be your advice? I mean, you hit on this earlier, but kind of parting advice to, say there's a 21-year-old guy on the end of this who lives in North Carolina that wants to pursue his craft and can't figure it out. And it may not be blacksmithing.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, if you haven't even found what it is you like to do, just try more stuff. I mean, just don't hesitate to take a blacksmithing class that costs $300, $400, because, it's the unknown. Because if you don't go and do that, then it's always in your mind like, oh man, should I have done this when I was younger? And so I think that's one thing that my parents really instilled in me, is like, just try as much stuff as you can and just, do this and that. And so I was always kind of like self-motivated in my hobbies growing up. So, like I said, I tried leather working here and there. You'll never see any of that stuff. It's all terrible. But same with woodworking, I would like refinish axes, put new handles on them, stuff like that. And so basically trying to work through those things, see what you like out of each process. And I think naturally you kind of start to narrow down what you don't like very quickly. And, then it just sort of starts pushing you into what you're made for, really. And, whether that's customer service, if you're great working with people, then, I mean, that's an extremely important skill, communication. And, like for me, it was working with my hands. And so, I just kind of fell into that path. But, I don't think there's any restrictions to what you're passionate about or whatever. But, I guess my advice would be try all these different things. And then if you find something that you feel you were kind of made for, or as long as it gives you purpose, I think pursue it. Whether it's a success or a failure, you're at least going to be content in the fact that you tried. And so I think that's the most important thing, really.
Are you sure you're 21? Well, man,
hey, I'm just saying stuff that my mentors always taught me.
It's good stuff, man. I think people are going to get a lot out of this. Well, I want to go see your setup. So thank you for doing this. It was really fun.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I greatly appreciate it.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.